Hello, my friend. Welcome to the long quiet. Tonight you are an old traveler boarding the last night train from a flag stop deep in the pines of northern Maine in January of 1908. By a little after 7 o'clock on a January evening in the year 1908, in the small wood-framed depot of a flag stop called Maple Hollow on the Bangor and Aroostook line in the deep northern country of Maine, an old man named Robert was waiting for the last train of the night. The depot was perhaps 15 feet by 20. It had a single room with a stove in the corner, a low wooden bench along the inside wall, a small ticket window that had been closed for an hour now, and a single oil lamp turned low on a beam above the bench. The lamp made a small, steady circle of yellow light, and outside that circle the room was the soft, dim brown of a small wooden room on a winter night. And outside the depot itself, the world was already in the long darkness of the deep January evening, when the cold has settled in and the snow has begun to fall. Robert had been waiting for perhaps 40 minutes. He was 68 years old. He had walked out from the small town of Brookline, which lay 2 miles east of the flag stop along a frozen wagon road, with his small leather valise in one hand and his cane in the other. And he had reached the depot at a little after 6, in plenty of time, the way he always reached the depot in plenty of time. He had set the valise on the floor beneath the bench. He had hung his hat on the peg by the door. He had sat down on the bench in the small, careful way of an older man sitting down. And he had begun the small, careful business of waiting. He had with him, besides the valise, an old wool cloak the color of wood smoke, a knit muffler his sister Annie had made him 11 Christmases ago, a flask of hot coffee that the woman at the boarding house had filled for him before he left, and a small leather-bound book of poems by Robert Browning that he had read perhaps 30 times over the long course of his life. He had not opened the book yet. He had only sat on the bench and looked at the small, steady flame of the lamp on the beam, and at the small, steady glow of the iron stove in the corner, and at the small, soft fall of snow, visible through the lower panes of the depot window, which were not so frosted that he could not see out. and through which the lamp on the platform outside cast its small yellow circle into the dark. The depot was very quiet. There was the soft hush of the stove. There was the slow, steady tick of the small clock above the ticket window, which had been ticking since 1890-something, and which would, Robert imagined, go on ticking long after he had gone home. There was the occasional small low wind that came down through the high pines around the depot and pressed against the southwest wall of the small building. Very gentle, very far, and then went away again. There was no other sound. There was no one else in the depot. There was no one else, so far as Robert knew, at this hour, on this small flag stop in this deep stretch of wood. He drank, after a time, a small, careful swallow from his flask of coffee. The coffee was still hot. The boarding house woman, whose name was Mrs. Pelletier, had been pouring his coffee for 14 years now, and she had become, over those years, very good at filling a flask in such a way that the coffee was still warm at the end of a long winter evening. He thanked her in his mind, the way he sometimes thanked the small absent people who made his life run. And he capped the flask and slipped it back into the inner pocket of his cloak. The clock on the wall read 7:14. The train was due at 7:30. The Bangor and Aroostook was, by the careful reckoning of its older conductors, a railroad of small reliability. It did what it said it would do when it said it would do it. In any weather, on any line, in any decade. The night train from Caribou to Bangor stopped at Maple Hollow only on flag, which is to say only when there was a passenger waiting on the platform with a small red lantern or a sign hung at the trackside. The station master, who lived in a small cottage 100 yards down the road from the depot, had come out earlier that evening and hung the small white sign at the trackside that indicated to the train that a passenger was waiting at Maple Hollow tonight. The sign was for Robert. Robert was the only passenger that night. He sat. The fire in the stove moved, very gentle, with the small, slow shifting of a fire that has its coals and its draught, and has settled in. A single small log let out a small dry pot. The lamp on the beam burned steady. The depot, by its own quiet way, was working itself around him. He had been in it many times. He knew its small features. He knew the place where the floorboards near the stove had been worn down a little by the small, careful walk of station masters going to add a log over 40 winters. He knew the small place on the ticket window where the wood had been polished smooth by the elbows of farmers leaning forward to ask about freight. He knew the small place on the bench where his own elbow always rested. He set his elbow there now without thinking. The clock above the ticket window ticked. The clock was a Seth Thomas of about 1890. It had a small brass pendulum behind a small glass panel, and the pendulum swung in a small, steady arc that Robert could hear in the deep quiet of the depot as a faint, whispered tick-tock. He had watched that pendulum for many cumulative hours of his life. He had watched it as a young man waiting for the morning train down to Bangor in the years after the war. He had watched it on the night he had come back from Bangor with his bride, when the train had been delayed an hour, and the two of them had sat side by side on this bench, and his wife had said, in her small, soft voice, that she liked the smell of the depot, and that it smelled like a place where small, honest things were done well. He thought of that now. He thought of it not as a sad thing. The bench under him still held him. The smell of the depot, which was the small, dry smell of 40 years of wood smoke and lamp oil and pine boards, was still here. The clock still ticked. The small, steady world of the small, steady depot at Maple Hollow had outlasted his wife and would, in time, outlast him. There was a quiet rightness in that. He sat with it. The wind far off made one small low call through the high pines along the cut. The pines did not move. The depot did not move. The flame on the beam did not move. After a few minutes, the door of the depot opened with the small, soft scrape it always made on its lower edge, and the station master came in. His name was Albert LeBron. He was about 50, a thin, spare man with a long gray mustache, and the small, steady eyes of a man who had worked 30 winters in a small forest siding without going mad. He had been the master at Maple Hollow since 1901. He nodded at Robert as he came in. Mr. Hollis, Mr. LeBran, Train's on time, far as the wire says. That's good. LeBron went to the small ticket window and unlocked the inside of it from the cabinet behind. He pulled a small sheaf of papers, looked them over, set them back. He came back around to the front. He bent down beside the stove and added a single small piece of birch to the coal. In the small, slow, careful way he added wood to a stove, and he settled the door back. The fire took the new wood. A small, fresh flame stood up, small and bright, behind the isinglass. "Cold tonight," he said. "Not bad," Robert said. "I've seen worse January." The 88. The 88, yes. LeBron made the small, low sound that Maine men make in agreement about a remembered hard winter. He stood for a moment by the stove, warming his back. He was dressed in his long blue railroad coat. He had been outside, walking the platform. "Anything you need before she comes through?" he asked. "No. Thank you. I've got coffee. Mrs. Pelletier's. Mrs. Pelletier's. She makes a good flask," he said. "I told her once she ought to be at the Bangor house. She said she'd rather be in Brookline. I expect that's true." LeBron nodded. He went back to the ticket window cabinet, locked it again, set the key on the small chain at his waist. He came back to the door. He paused with his hand on the latch. "I'll be on the platform when she comes," he said. "You'll hear me ring the bell." "All right. Good night in any case, Mr. Hollis." "Good night, Mr. LeBron." LeBron stepped out into the snow. The door closed behind him with the same small, soft scrape. The depot was quiet again. The clock ticked. The lamp burned steady. Robert sat for some time without moving. He did not pick up the book of poems. He did not drink again from the flask. He simply sat. The room was warm enough. The bench was firm under him. The lamp was small enough to be friendly, and large enough to read by if he had wished to read. The world, in the small, careful way it sometimes did, was being kind. Outside, the snow was thickening. Robert turned on the bench to look more directly through the lower pane. He could see the small platform outside. The long, bare planks of it dusted with snow. and beyond the platform, the dark of the rails going off east and west into the trees. And beyond the rails, the long stand of high pines that ran along the cut. The pines were dark and very still, and held the snow on their branches with the small, patient grace that old pines develop in winter country. A few flakes drifted down through the small yellow circle of the platform lamp, very slow, the way flakes drift when there is no wind in the air. It was, he thought, very beautiful. He thought this with the small, unembarrassed inward sigh of a man who had been thinking it about the same scene at the same flagstop for 40 years of his life. He had grown up not 3 miles from Maple Hollow. He had taken his first train ride from this depot at the age of 9, going with his father down to Bangor for a doctor. He had taken the train out from Maple Hollow as a young man going off to work in the lumber camps further north. He had taken the train back at the end of those years. He had brought his bride home from Bangor on this line in 1868, on a winter evening not unlike this one. Sitting beside her in the second car of the Tuesday night train, holding her gloved hand under the small wool throw, the railroad gave its winter passengers. She had been 22 years old. He had been 28. She had died 9 years ago. She had been very tired at the end. He thought of her now as he often thought of her, in the small, soft way of a man who has been left with the long quiet of a life. And the long quiet did not seem to him a sad thing. It seemed to him a thing he could carry. The snow falling outside, the lamp on the beam burning steady, the small clock ticking, the small fire breathing in the corner, the long stand of pines beyond the rail. These were a kind of company. He had grown old enough to take them as company. He drank again. A small, careful swallow of the coffee. In the distance, very far off and very faint, he heard the first call of the train. It was not a loud call. It was the slow, long, low note of a steam whistle far up the line, perhaps 3 miles off, blowing for some small crossing on the dark road. It came down through the pines like a sound coming a long way through deep water. And it touched him in the chest the way it had touched him in the chest every time he had heard it since he was a small boy. Which was to say, with the small, steady promise that the train was coming, that the world was working, that the rails which had been laid here by the men of 2 generations ago were still being kept, still being used, still being run upon in the deep cold of the deep January night by a train with a careful engineer and a careful fireman and a careful conductor, and one small empty siding at Maple Hollow to flag at, where one passenger sat waiting. He set the flask down on the bench beside him. He stood slowly in the way he stood now, holding to the back of the bench with one hand. He picked up the cane. He picked up the valise. He stepped in his thick wool boots to the door of the depot. He opened it. The cold of the platform came in at him in a slow, gentle wave. But it was not a sharp cold. It was the deep, settled cold of a winter that had been winter for 2 months and had no further surprises in it. Robert was dressed for it. He stepped out onto the platform. He pulled the door shut behind him. The snow was falling now in long, even curtains. Very slow. The platform lamp burned its small yellow circle. The dark of the pines beyond was very dark. The 2 iron rails where they ran in front of the platform were beginning to be lined faintly with white. He stood in the snow with his valise in his hand and his cane in his other hand, and he looked east along the rails into the dark, and he waited. After perhaps 2 minutes, the whistle came again. Closer now. It was the same long, low note. It was now perhaps a mile off. He could see far down the line the small, slow growing of a yellow light against the dark of the trees, which was the headlamp of the locomotive, working through the long, slow turn that the rails made through the pines a mile east of Maple Hollow. The headlamp grew. The whistle came once more. Closer still. The snow falling around him went on, slow and patient in its long, even curtain. He did not move. He simply stood in the small yellow circle of the platform lamp and watched the train come. The light grew. It grew slowly, the way the headlamp of a steam train grows in the dark of a winter forest, which is to say with no hurry, the way an immense thing draws near. He could begin to hear now the long, deep working sound of the engine, the slow, heavy chuff of the cylinders, the soft, heavy turning of the rods, and behind that the long, high singing of the rails themselves, which is a sound that no other sound in the world quite matches. The small, constant hum of two iron bars set across an immense wooden country and carrying an immense black machine slowly along them. The light grew larger. The chuffing grew louder. The whistle came one last time. Very close. Very long. The long greeting whistle that the engineers of the Bangor and Aroostook used to announce themselves to small flag stops along the line. And then the locomotive came around the last bend, and Robert could see it. It was a black locomotive with a tall stack and a great brass headlamp and a small spread of red on the wheels where the cab lamp caught them. It was the number 17, which he had ridden many times, and which the line had been running on the night route from Caribou to Bangor for the past 11 years. He knew its sound. He knew the small particular hiss of its valves as the engineer let off pressure for the approach. He knew the small particular way it slowed. It slowed now. The long curtain of snow ahead of it parted around its great black shape. The headlamp threw its long yellow beam across the platform and across Robert in his small yellow circle of lamplight, and held him for a moment in the broader beam of itself, and then moved on. The locomotive came past him slowly, slowly, very slowly. The great black bulk of it gentle in its passing. The small red glow of the firebox visible through the open door of the cab. The small dark figure of the fireman bending to his shovel. The small steady figure of the engineer leaning out of his window and giving Robert the small flat nod that engineers of that line had given waiting passengers at small flag stops for 50 years. Robert nodded back. The locomotive passed. The tender passed with its mountain of coal under a soft cap of snow. The first car passed. The mail car, lit dim from within. The second car passed. The passenger car lit warm yellow from within. And through the windows of it, Robert could see in the soft yellow light perhaps 4 or 5 people, scattered, mostly asleep. 1 or 2 with newspapers folded across their chests. The small, still tableau of a half-empty night train car at the end of a long winter run. The train came to a stop. It came to a stop slow with the long sigh of brakes. And then there was a moment in which the engine simply stood and breathed. The slow, heavy chuff of the cylinders quieted. The valves let out a single long, sustained sigh of white steam, which rose slow and curling into the dark above the platform lamp. The fireman in the cab leaned out and looked once down the line, and once up the line, and once at Robert, and then went back to his shovel. The engineer leaned again from his window. He raised a hand in greeting. "Mr. Hollis," he called low. "Good evening, Mr. Carter," Robert called back. Carter had been the engineer on the night Caribou Bangor for 9 years. They had ridden together many times. They knew each other in the small, particular way of an engineer and his most regular passenger. A figure descended from between the second car and the third. It was the conductor, a small, wiry man in a long blue coat with brass buttons. His name was Pelletier, a cousin, Robert thought, of the boarding house Pelletier in Brookline. And he had been the conductor on this line for the better part of 2 decades. He carried in one hand the small kerosene lantern of the railroad, in which the wick was turned low for the night runs. And in his other hand, he held a small leather-bound book of the railroads, in which he made small notes about whom he had picked up where. "Maple Hollow," he said mildly as if to himself. "Maple Hollow," Robert agreed. "Bangor for you tonight, Mr. Hollis." Bangor. Same as ever. All right. Step up. He took Robert's valise from him with the small, unobtrusive courtesy of a man who has handed many older men up the iron steps of the railroad. And he set the valise on the platform of the car. And he offered Robert his arm for the small step up. Robert took it. He found the step with his cane, and the iron handrail with his free hand. And he came up onto the platform of the second car. In the small, careful way he came up onto platforms now. Pelletier set the valise back into his hand. "Find a seat as you like, Mr. Hollis. We're light tonight." "Thank you, Mr. Pelletier. Bangor is 1 o'clock. "I know. I'll come by for the ticket when we're moving." "All right." Pelletier touched the brim of his cap. Robert touched the brim of his hat. And Robert stepped with his cane and his valise. through the small door at the head of the second car, and he was inside the warm yellow light of the night train. The car was about half full, perhaps a little less. It was the kind of half full that night trains are on weekday nights in the deep middle of January, when there is no special reason to be moving, and the people on the train are people who simply happen to need to be where they are going by morning. There was an older woman in the front row asleep, with a wool throw across her lap, and her head against the dark wood of the window frame. There was a young man perhaps 3 rows back, awake but reading, very slow by the small ceiling lamp above his seat. A small periodical of some kind. There was a middle-aged couple in the middle of the car, both asleep, leaning gently against one another in the small, unconscious way of long-married people. There were 1 or 2 others further down. There was, in the back third of the car, no one at all. Robert walked slow, the length of the car. He passed each sleeping passenger the way a man passes anyone sleeping on a night train, which is to say without looking. He came at last to a seat near the rear, on the side that would, he knew, face north when the train pulled out, and would therefore face the open dark of the country he was leaving, rather than the small lights of the road he had walked in on. He set the valise on the seat across from him. He set the cane against the wall. He sat himself down, slow, careful, in the small, careful way of an older man finding a seat on a night train. The seat was a long bench of polished mahogany, covered in a deep red velvet that had been new in 1880-something, and was now worn smooth and soft in the way velvet gets after many decades of being sat upon by passengers in heavy winter coats. The wall against which the seat was set was a wall of dark, polished wood. The window above the seat was a tall, double-paned window, fogged at the corners, framed in oak. A small brass reading lamp jutted from the wall above his head. He didn't turn it on. The ceiling lamp 3 rows up was enough. He let himself sit a moment without doing anything. The car was warm. The radiator under the seat, fed by the steam of the locomotive ahead, made a small, low whisper of heat. The smell in the car was the smell of all old passenger cars on winter night runs. The small, dry smell of warm velvet. the faint, sweet smell of kerosene from the ceiling lamps, the faintest possible smell of coal smoke that had worked its way back from the locomotive through the small joints of the doors. He breathed it in. He breathed it out. It was the smell of his life. He had ridden in this kind of car perhaps 800 times. Outside the window above him, the snow was falling, very gentle across the platform of Maple Hollow. He looked up at it. He could see through the upper pane the dark of the high pines beyond the cut, and the small yellow circle of the platform lamp, and the slow, soft fall of flakes through it. He could see very dimly the small shape of the depot from which he had just come, with the lamp on its beam still glowing through the lower window. The depot looked smaller from inside the train than it had looked from inside itself. He smiled, very small at this thought. He had always thought it. He had always smiled at it. Somewhere up ahead, the locomotive let out a long single sigh of steam. Pelletier came down the aisle, quiet in his blue coat. He stopped at Robert's seat. Robert had his ticket already in his hand. Pelletier took it. He punched it with the small brass punch he wore on his lapel chain, and he handed it back. "Bangor by 1, he said low. "There's a long stretch of running through the pines tonight. Smooth, though. The track's been swept. Get some sleep if you like, Mr. Hollis." "Thank you. Anything I can bring you?" "No. Thank you. Good night, then." Pelletier moved on down the aisle in his small, careful walk. Robert watched him go for a moment in the same way he watched anyone walk away in the warm yellow light of a night train. Then he looked back out the window at the falling snow, at the depot, at the platform lamp, at the small flag stop at Maple Hollow which he was leaving. The engine ahead took up its slow, heavy chuck. The train, with the small, low forward motion of a great patient thing being set into motion, began to move. The first turn of the wheels was almost imperceptible. Robert felt it as a small shift in his bones, not in his eyes. The platform lamp outside the window held still for a moment, and then began very slowly to slide to the left. The depot beside it began to slide too. The high pines began to slide. The whole world of Maple Hollow, the small lit world he had been sitting in for the past hour, began to give way and to be replaced, slow and gentle, by the dark wall of the pine forest east of the cut. He watched it go. The platform lamp slid out of sight. The depot slid out of sight. The high pines closed in. The window beside him became, very quickly, a window onto only the dark of the deep January forest, with the slow, even fall of snow visible in the small spill of light from the car's own ceiling lamps, falling out through the glass into the night. The train began to make in earnest. The slow, steady clack-clack of its wheels over the rail joints. It was a slow rhythm. The Bangor and Aroostook in 1908 ran its night trains at no great speed, perhaps 30 miles an hour through the long forest stretches. And the clack-clack was an unhurried rhythm. Robert had ridden in cars where the rhythm was much faster, on the southern lines, on the trains that ran along the coast, through the open country south of Portland. Those rhythms were a different kind. This rhythm was the rhythm of a slow train, moving through deep snow country on a long winter night. And it had, for him, the long, honest comfort of a thing he had known all his life. He let his head rest back against the wall behind him. The car rocked, very gentle. He watched through the lower part of the window the dark forest pass. There was very little to see. There was the slow, regular passing of black trunks against the slightly less black of the snow that lay between them. There was, here and there, the brief, small gleam of the train's own light catching on a snowy branch close to the cut. There was, occasionally, a long opening through the trees where, far off, very small, the warm yellow window of some farm or homestead glowed for an instant against the dark and was gone. Robert liked these glimpses. He liked the small, unspoken thought that somewhere out in the deep cold of the deep January night, there was another small lit room with someone in it. Perhaps a farm wife banking a stove for the night. Perhaps a man reading at a table by a kerosene lamp. Perhaps only a child awake who had been asked by a tired mother to lie still and to wait for sleep. The window of one such farm passed. The window of another, much later, passed. In between, only the long, dark passing of the pine. Robert thought in the slow, soft way of a man on a warm winter train. of how very many pines there were in this part of the country. He had grown up among them. He had hunted in them as a boy. He had worked in the camps that cut some of them. The year he was 21, far north of here on the Allagash, he had walked in them with his wife. In the slow, long summer evenings of the early years of their marriage, when they would take a small picnic out to the small clearing at the edge of the old Hollis farm, and would sit on a folded blanket and would, for an hour or two at a time, simply listen to the pines breathing in the high air above them. He had thought then that the pines were friends. He had thought it as a small inward thought. He had thought it ever since. The pines outside the window now passed dark and slow. Dark and slow, in the long, even rhythm that the train made of all things outside it. Inside the car, the warm yellow light of the ceiling lamps held. The radiator whispered. The old woman in the front row turned, very slight in her sleep. The young man with the periodical had set his reading aside and was now looking out his own window with the small, absent look of a man being lulled by the long passing of the country. The middle-aged couple slept on, leaning. Pelletier had gone forward, perhaps to ride for a stretch in the cab with the engineer, as conductors sometimes did on these long, quiet stretches. Robert took the small leather book of Browning out of his cloak. He set it on his knee. He didn't open it. He simply held it. The cover was warm now from his pocket. The leather had the small particular smell of an old book that had been with a man for many years, which is a smell that is not quite of leather and not quite of paper, but is of both together, and of the long company of a thing that has been touched many evenings. He had bought the book in 1873 in a small bookshop on Hammond Street in Bangor on a Saturday afternoon, with his wife at his side. He had been 33 years old. The bookseller had been an old man named Williamson who had since died, and whose shop had since closed, and whose son had moved away to Boston and become, Robert had heard, an attorney of some kind. The book had outlived all of them except Robert, and would in time outlive him too, and would presumably end up, he thought, in some small grandchild's hands, Perhaps his granddaughter Elise's. Perhaps her child's after her. And the small ceremony of opening the book and reading a few slow lines on a winter night would, perhaps, continue for some small number of generations more. He did not open it tonight either. He set it back into his pocket. He looked out the window again. Some long stretch of country passed without any farm light at all. The trees were thicker here, perhaps. Or the country was more sparsely settled. The dark was deeper. The small spill of light from the car's own ceiling lamps fell out onto the snow beside the track and made for a moment the small reaching shadow of the car itself visible against the snow, like a long, thin black hand laid over the white. Robert watched this with the small inward smile that the small inward things of long train journeys give a man who has been on many of them. The train made somewhere up ahead the small unfamiliar sound of crossing a small wooden trestle. The clack of the rails changed for a few seconds to the small, deeper hum of timber being driven over. And then it went back to the regular clack of the standard rail. Robert knew this trestle. It crossed a small stream that ran south into the east branch of the Penobscot. He had fished it once, perhaps in 1881. There had been brook trout in it. There were still brook trout in it, he supposed. Streams did not. In the deep country of Maine, change very much from year to year. The car rocked. Gentle. The trestle ended. The standard clack resumed. After perhaps half an hour, Robert reached into his cloak and took out the flask of coffee. He poured a small, careful measure into the small tin cup that was the cap of the flask. He drank. It was still warm. Mrs. Pelletier, he thought again, was a remarkable woman. He capped the flask. He set it on the seat beside him. He looked back out the window. His eyes had begun, very slow, to do the small, heavy thing they did at the end of a long day. He did not fight it. He had ridden enough night trains to know that the way you ride a night train, when you have a long way to go and there is no reason to stay awake, is that you let your eyes do what they want. He let them. He let his shoulders, which had been carrying the small unconscious tensions of the long evening of waiting at Maple Hollow, settle. He let his hands, which had been folded in his lap, fall a little apart. He let his head against the polished wood of the wall behind him rest more fully. The car rocked, gentle. The wheels went clack, 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 clack. Slow. The forest passed. After some time, perhaps an hour, perhaps less, the train slowed. Robert opened his eye. The window beside him showed the same dark forest, but more slowly now. The ceiling lamps of the car flickered, very small, in the way they sometimes did when the locomotive throttled down. He understood in the small, drowsy way of a man who has been mostly asleep on a night train that the train was approaching some small siding. He looked up the aisle. Pelletier was standing at the front of the car, looking out the small forward window. The young man with the periodical had set it on his lap and was looking out his own window. The old woman in the front row was still asleep. The train came, slow to a stop. The conductor opened the small door at the front of the car. Robert could see in the brief opening the dark of another platform outside and the small yellow circle of another platform lamp and the long iron tower of a water tank set against the snow. The fireman, far ahead, climbed down with his long pole to swing the water spout into the tender. There was the slow, distant hiss of water being added to the boiler. Voice, very faint, of the engineer talking to the small station master of this even smaller siding. Robert watched, sleepy, through his window. There was no one waiting on this platform. The train had only stopped for water. The platform lamp burned its small yellow circle. The snow fell through it. Behind the platform stood a small dark shape of a station house, smaller even than Maple Hollow's, with a single lit window on its second floor, where presumably the station master's family was settling for the night. The water took perhaps 5 minutes. Then the fireman swung the spout back. The engineer leaned out, checked, leaned back. Pelletier in the front of the car watched. The slow, heavy chuff began again. The train began, very slow to move. The platform lamp slid past. The water tower slid past. The small, dark station house slid past. The dark of the pines closed in. The train took up again its slow, steady clack, clack. Robert let his head rest back against the wall. The lamp 3 rows up still burned. Pelletier walked soft down the aisle, turning down each ceiling lamp as he passed it, in the small, slow way that conductors of that line dim their cars for the long middle of the night. The car grew darker. The lamps that remained burned smaller, yellower. The dark of the forest outside became the brighter thing now. Robert could see more clearly than before the slow fall of snow against the window and the dim shapes of the passing pines beyond. The car rocked. The wheels clacked. The radiator under his seat whispered. He thought in the slow, soft way thoughts come on the warm seat of a winter night train, of Maple Hollow. He thought of the small wooden depot, of the small, steady tick of the clock, of the small, steady flame of the lamp on the beam. He thought of the boarding house in Brookline, of Mrs. Pelletier filling the flask. He thought of the long stand of pines around the cut. He thought of his wife, gone now 9 years, who had ridden on this same line beside him through more winters than he could count, who had liked the dim, warm yellow of the ceiling lamps and the slow clack of the wheel and the small, soft fall of snow against the windows. He thought of her without sorrow. He thought of her with the small, steady warmth of a long marriage that has ended only in its outward form, the inward form of it being carried still in him on this same night train, on this same line, through this same forest, 68 years old, and going home to Bangor where his daughter was waiting. His daughter would be waiting on the platform in Bangor at 1 o'clock with her husband. They would help him into their motor car. They would drive him to the small house at Hammond Street where he would stay through the rest of January, the way he stayed every January until the bad cold of February broke. His granddaughter, who was 8, would be asleep when they got there. But in the morning, she would come down to the kitchen and would find him at the table with his coffee, and would, very small, climb into his lap. He thought of her, too. He thought of all of them. In the slow, soft way thoughts come. And his eyes did the slow, heavy thing again. And this time, he did not open them. The car rocked. The wheels clacked. The radiator whispered. His shoulders, which had relaxed at Maple Hollow, relaxed further. His hands let go further. His jaw, which had been holding the small unconscious tension of waiting and walking and boarding, went soft. His belly, beneath the heavy wool of his cloak, settled. The train held him. The train had held him many times. It knew how to hold him. His thoughts slowed. They became no longer thoughts, but only the gentle drift of one thing into another. The lamp on the beam at Maple Hollow. The slow, long whistle of number 17 coming through the pines. The brass punch in Pelletier's hand. The polished wood of the wall behind his head. The slow, even fall of snow outside the window. The small, warm yellow of the lamps 3 rows up. The long, honest clack-clack of the wheels under him. He let it pass over him. He let it pass over him again. The train moved on, slow and patient, through the long forest of northern Maine, and the snow went on falling, slow and patient, through the long January night. And Robert, who was tired and warm and not afraid, drifted gently down into the deep, easy quiet of sleep. The wheels went clack, clack. The radiator whispered. The ceiling lamps burned small. And somewhere ahead, far off, the headlamp of number 17 kept its slow forward beam against the dark, and the engineer Carter watched the line, and the fireman fed the firebox, and the conductor Pelletier walked, slow, down the aisle of the 3rd car, turning the small wicks of the ceiling lamps a little lower. And the train moved on through the snow toward Bangor. And Robert slept. And the night kept being the night. And that was all. And now, few quiet words to carry into sleep. You are safe. You are warm. The day is done. Nothing more is asked of you tonight. The room around you holds you gently. The bed beneath you holds you fully. Your body knows how to rest. Your mind may let go now. The long quiet is here. Sleep well, my friend. From the long quiet, sleep well, my friend. From the long quiet.